It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight. Aaron Haiman has been a student of nature his entire life and has lived and birded in the California Delta for over a decade. Aaron has experience working for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy and now serves as Senior Environmental Science at the Wildlife Conservation Board. Please join me in welcoming Aaron Haiman.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Appreciate the introduction. And let's see.
Stop my share.
I will start sharing. Can everybody see the slides okay? So those
I'm
looking
good.
with it? All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. It's great to be here and to talk to you a little bit about the birds of the California Delta and the California Delta itself, and the new book that I have out. For the plan for today, this evening, um, I would like to talk to you a little bit about the science communication work that I do briefly, and then we'll jump into kind of Delta stuff. What is a Delta? Talk about our Delta, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, and the birds of the Delta, some of the threats that the Delta is facing and sort of the complications, and also then leave on kind of an uplifting note, talking about how the Delta is being recognized right now and the work that's being done to restore it, which is work that I've been involved in and I'm really excited about to be able to share with you. So with no further ado, um, alongside my sort of professional work with the Delta Conservancy and the Wildlife Conservation Board, I've been a science communicator for a long time. And I'm started off as a blog. I'm active on a variety of different platforms, from writing for my own blog, writing for other people's blogs and various magazines. Um, Also, I have a YouTube channel and I'm active on a variety of different social media platforms, all under the heading of a birding naturalist. And in person, I lead bird walks often. I lead a youth birdathon team for Point Blue Conservation Science every year. We're the Drakes Beach Sanderlings, in case you ever hear about us. We are the longest running youth birdathon team that I have ever heard of, that I think is in existence. And then my latest kind of endeavor in communicating science and birds to everybody who will possibly listen to me is this book, Birds of the California Delta. It came out in March, so it's still sort of hot off the presses. And it's been a really exciting process to be involved in. I am hugely fortunate to partner with Martha Espinoza, who did all of the illustrations for the book. And she's an incredibly talented Costa Rican nature illustrator and scientific illustrator. And uh, just could not have been happier when I reached out to her and asked her if she would join me on this kind of crazy adventure of creating a book. And she said yes. So I encourage you all, like, go. She's also pretty active on social media. You can find her website if you want some to look at some amazingly beautiful illustrations of a huge variety of biology and biodiversity. She's got just amazing stuff to check out. The book is published by Heyday Books, which is a small independent book publishing company based out of Berkeley, California. And this book is part of a series on what they refer to as hyper-local birding. So the bird books in this series are not trying to be comprehensive field guides. They are instead trying to really dial in and identify 25 species that exemplify the particular very small geographic area that that book focuses on, and kind of tell the stories of those birds and explain some of their characters and behaviors and kind of bring a more personal and engaging and sort of warmer approach to these areas and these birds, rather than like a strictly sort of colder, more sort of formalized static field guide. So, like I said, there have been 3 other books before this one, and now this is bird book number 4, Birds of the California Delta, which I was delighted to partner with them to write. Throughout all of my professional and science communication work, so professional and personal, I am a big fan of birding. I've definitely gotten a lot out of birding, both personally and professionally, and I think that everybody else deserves to have the same opportunities if they are even vaguely interested in it. And so I really strive to make birding and kind of the bird community and the science community, the nature community in general, as welcoming a place for everybody. So it's something I really feel strongly about, and I'm delighted to meet others who agree with that general philosophy. And with me out of the way, let's talk about deltas. In particular, like, first off, what is a delta? And the sort of strict definition of a delta is it's a tract of sediment deposited at the mouth of a river. That's what a delta is. So when water reaches the mouth of a river, it tends to slow down, it tends to spread out. And as it does that, the sediment in that water kind of settles. And so you have this sort of chunk of land that's kind of covered in this fine sediment, layer after layer, that builds up. And, here we have the Nile Delta, a very famous delta. The Nile, of course, is where the Nile River opens and sort of flows into the Mediterranean Sea. But it doesn't have to necessarily be where a river flows into a sea. It can flow into a large lake. There can be a variety of different settings that form a delta, but it's always at the mouth of a river. And something that many people have noticed is that it doesn't form just any shape. They often form, they almost usually, in fact, form this sort of triangular shape. And in fact, if you look at, deltas around the world, here are three famous deltas, they all kind of form their own special triangular shape, which is actually useful because that's where we get delta from. Why are they actually called deltas of all things? Where does that word come from? Well, it's from the capital form of the fourth letter in the Greek alphabet. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta is a triangle. And so when people notice this pattern of these sort of sediment tracks forming triangles, looking around for a name, say, well, there's this symbol that's already a triangle. We'll use that. And so the delta was given its name as a sort of geographic formation. Our delta, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, is a really special delta. It's a really special place. Right in the center of California, it is the beating heart in so many ways of California's water system, both natural systems and our sort of human engineered systems. It all kind of centers on the delta. It's home to a hugely diverse set of habitats, and it's this really complex landscape of dozens of islands with well over 1,000 miles of waterways sort of networking in throughout those islands. So it's a really detailed, nuanced, complex landscape to get to hang out in, which makes it really interesting. Its formation is kind of an interesting story, and it kind of results in an oddity of our delta. And that is that our delta is not really very triangularly shaped. And that's because about 100 million years ago, the Sierra Nevadas were formed. So they had this big mountain range there in sort of what is now Eastern California. And at the time, flowing off the western escarpment of the Sierra Nevadas was basically just a long, flat plain that led all the way out to the ocean, pretty much uninterrupted. And it stayed that way until about 5 million years ago, when, due to sort of more complex plate tectonic activity, the Coast Range was kind of crumpled up right at the edge of California. And so that left this big open space in between that wasn't too much affected by either the Sierras and the geologic forces that forced those up, or the tectonic forces that forced the Coast Range up. That meant that it was this sort of open space that could then get filled with ice during the last ice age. And as that ice age ended about 10,000 years ago, those glaciers that had covered most of California retreated. And that did a couple of things. One is, as those glaciers pulled back, they really ground down and flattened out that space in between these two mountain ranges. And so that really left us with this broad, flat Central Valley that we see today. And the other thing it did is, as the ice retreated from the edges of those mountain ranges, the western edge of the Sierras and the eastern edge of the Coast Range, it left these bare mountains sort of to collect water and then to have rivers flow off of them. And a lot of rivers did that. We have so many rivers in California, and so many of our biggest rivers are all flowing into that sort of Central Valley area, eventually meeting with each other, kind of merging together, slowing down, forming this wide, broad, wetland kind of habitat that is what we now call the California Delta. And this process has done some really interesting stuff with sediment and soil formation. So those rivers coming down out of the Coast Range, and especially the Sierras, carried a lot of sediment with them, mostly inorganic sediment, as it was those sort of granite mountain ranges were starting to erode. As it formed this flat area at the bottom, as those rivers reached it and as it brought down that inorganic sediment, wetland plants started to grow in that broad flat area. And of course, as those wetlands plants grew, they eventually died. And as those dead plants were incorporated in and kind of mixed with that inorganic material, you had this mixing of organic and inorganic together, which formed layers. And because of the shape of the Delta of the Central Valley and California, and because there's really only one place for water to get out of the Central Valley and flow out, and that is the Carquinez Strait that flows into the San Francisco Bay, that means that a lot of those rivers were kind of trapped, and a lot of that sediment was also kind of trapped. It wasn't able to wash out to sea, which meant that that mixing of organic plant material and inorganic contributions from the mountains, layered upon layered, mixed together, and formed this incredibly thick layer of a very special type of soil called peat. Peat soils are really nutrient rich. They're very high in carbon. And that's a point that I really want you to remember because we're going to come back to it. It's going to play an important role later. Very high in carbon. Because of all these nutrients and all of this carbon, deltas around the world and for all of human history have been really important to human development, in particular to agriculture once humans started developing agriculture. It's a really great place for us to grow a lot of our food. Those nutrient rich soils also support a huge array of habitats, and we've got a little bit of everything in the Delta. Our Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta supports wetlands, sloughs, oak savannas, grasslands, vernal pools. Like we've got everything here. Cottonwood gallery forests. We have, of course, a lot of agriculture in the Delta. There's a lot of farmlands and vineyards, pasture land, stuff like that. And then there's also quite a few people who live in the Delta. So you've got urban and suburban development as well. Got everything, which is another reason that the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta is such an interesting place to go. It's not a huge area, and yet you can travel relatively short distances and hit all these different habitat types in a single visit. Very exciting, very cool place to hang out. And of course, with those diversity of habitats come a diversity of animals and plants, life. We have tons of different plant species that live in the Delta, many different mammals, reptiles, and amphibians, a gazillion insects, some of which are actually rather endangered, so they're kind of rare insects, which make them exciting. We have fish, both migratory and resident, that live here in the Delta, at least for a portion of their lives, and likewise, birds, both migratory and resident, that live here in the Delta, at least for a portion of their lives. And, you know, all those other things are cool. The birds are obviously what we're going to focus on. There are especially large number of birds here because of the Pacific Flyway. And as I'm sure many of you know, the Pacific Flyway is like this super highway system that connects 3 different continents together across thousands of miles and are used by hundreds of different species. Now, not every species or every individual is going to use every mile of that superhighway, but there are so many birds, millions of birds every year use at least some portion of this Pacific Flyway. And the Delta lies smack on it, which means that it's an incredibly important spot for many of those birds using that flyway. Some of them use them just as a stopover site. They're coming from the north and they're going to points farther south. So they're just stopping here, resting up, getting some food, and then moving on, and the reverse when they're coming back north. Some of them actually are seasonal visitors where this Delta is their final destination, either for winter or for spring and summer. But either way, it makes the Delta a really important link in the overall chain of the Pacific Flyway. Of those many species, at least 250 of them, bird species, use the delta at some point. And like I kind of alluded to just now, you kind of break them into four different sort of categories of birds as far as their use of the delta. There are summer visitors, which are coming here as their final destination during the breeding season to find mates and establish territories and get food and raise babies, et cetera, et cetera. There are winter visitors, where again, this is their final destination, but for a different part of the year. These birds are coming here usually from points north to rest here and use the delta as a place to fuel up so that they can have a really good spring migration and then following breeding season. And it's been interesting. Research has shown that what happens to a bird on its wintering grounds actually has really important, they're called carryover effects, to the rest of their life. So a bird that has a really good winter will often have a much more successful migration, and it carries on even further to having a much more successful breeding season. Whereas a bird that has a rough winter doesn't get the necessary rest and resources that it needs, has struggles, has higher mortality rates during their spring migration, and also lower reproductive successes on the breeding grounds if they do make it. Then, of course, we've got our migrants, birds that basically are just zipping through the delta in spring and fall. They've got places to be, and they are just here for a stopover. And then you've got almost the exact opposites, birds that are here. They've realized the delta is a cool place to live, and they just camp out permanently. They're year-round residents. Now, unfortunately, there are a lot of bird species across the US that are at risk. And one of the good ways of tracking these birds is by paying attention to the State of the Birds report. The 2025 State of the Birds just came out recently. This is a report produced by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And it's where they go and they look at the population sort of fluctuations and trends of every species of bird in a geographic area. So, say the United States. And they kind of, depending on the numbers and the directions of those trends, they group birds into different categories. So they're like the green colored birds that are the ones that they're pretty healthy. They're doing just fine. There's a fair number of them, not really much to worry about. They have yellow alert species that are, a little bit more concerning. Maybe they have smaller populations. Maybe they have slightly downtrending population numbers. There are orange alert species, and then there are the red alert species, which, and I'll just read this quote from their definition. A red alert species is they're birds with perilously low populations and steep declining trends. So very low numbers, and they're going the wrong direction. And of those, there are actually 5 of them that are found in the Delta that I kind of want to highlight a little bit now. One of them is the yellow-billed magpie. This is, by the way, one of Martha's illustrations from my book. This is a California endemic, so it's one of 2 species of bird that's found in California and nowhere else on Earth, which makes it a really special bird. They've naturally evolved to live in sort of these grassy savanna-type habitats, but they're also fairly adaptable. I mean, they're corvids, so they have a lot of those classic corvidy kind of traits, one of them being adaptability to their habitats and their tolerance of humans. So they do sort of reasonably well in some human-dominated habitats. Unfortunately, they have a restricted geographic range, and their population levels are being driven down by a few different threats. One is West Nile virus. West Nile virus is something that hits certain groups of birds much harder than other groups, and sadly, corvids, so jays, crows, ravens, magpies, are one of those groups. Corvids get hit especially hard by West Nile virus. Another thing that this species has to deal with is rodenticides. They are omnivores, as is true of so many corvids, and they're often very creative and clever in looking at different ways of finding food, and that includes sometimes eating rodents. That sometimes includes eating carrion, and if that carrion happens to be a rodent that was poisoned, that ate some rodenticide, these birds can often get secondary poisoning from rodenticides. So it's a really good reminder to not use rodenticides if at all possible when controlling rodent populations. And also, those oak savannas, there's often some pressures to convert those to other types of habitat. And so habitat loss is another thing that this species is facing, all of which sort of combining together lands them on the red alert species list. The second one I'd like to talk about is the tricolored blackbird. This one is, I call sort of a near endemic to California. It's most of its population is definitely in California. There are a few scattered populations outside, so it's not strictly endemic, but it's close. Historically, these birds nested in wetlands like cattails and tules and stuff like that. And they've also managed to find some agricultural fields to also serve as suitable nesting habitats. They really like mustard. They'll sometimes nest in like wheat or rice fields. They have a fun connection between the coast in that many of the breeding birds that hang out in these big colonies in the interior of California migrate out to Point Reyes, like outer Point Reyes, and they stay there for the winter and then come back. So they have this migration that's almost completely within California, just back and forth between different parts of the state. They are being considered right now for federal listing. They're already recognized as a threatened species by California, but the federal government was considering them for listing under the Endangered Species Act. I will say that with the current federal environment, it is unclear what's going to happen with that consideration. And I certainly am not holding my breath, which is a real bummer because this bird is definitely declining kind of precipitously. 100 years ago, 200 years ago, you could go out and find breeding colonies of these birds that numbered 300,000 birds in a single colony. This is one of the biggest nesting colony birds anywhere on the continent. In fact, the only bird that used to have even larger breeding colonies was the passenger pigeon, which of course is sadly extinct now. So, really hoping to avoid that. Though the population now, the total tricolored blackbird population numbers at about 300,000. So, what used to be one single colony is now represented by the entire species. So, that's quite a reduction in numbers. And those are because of losses of their wetland habitats. Wetlands get destroyed a lot. They're very cool, very useful places to us humans. And so we tend to convert a lot into agriculture, and especially into, often agriculture that is not useful to tricolored blackbirds. And unfortunately, even when the type of agriculture is growing a crop that these tricolored blackbirds can breed in, that still sometimes puts them into conflict with farmers because oftentimes there is a matching up of when birds are breeding and when a field needs to be harvested. And so that puts farmers in kind of this really unfortunate bind where they have to make the choice. Do they destroy a nesting colony but bring in their crop? Or do they forego bringing their crop but suffer the economic, like they don't make any income off of that anymore? So figuring out threading that needle is definitely something that many people who are working on tricolored blackbirds is trying to figure out. And then, of course, another thing that we often do to wetlands is we drain them and we build houses on them. We create sort of these urban and suburban habitats, which are really not useful to tricolored blackbirds at all. So combining those threats all together is what put this species on the red alert list. The Ridgway's rail is another one. Found, again, sort of scattered parts of California, but also a bit of Mexico. This is a tidal species, so they live in tidal wetlands. This is not being consistent. It is already listed as federally threatened. But they're definitely facing quite a few threats. Again, they live in these wetlands, and like I said, wetlands get destroyed a lot, so habitat destruction is a very big problem. They often also, since they're a low nesting bird, like ground nesting species, their nests are very vulnerable to predation, and in particular to invasive species and domestic species. So things like dogs and especially cats have been shown to have a really big impact eating the chicks, sometimes the eggs, sometimes the adults of this species. So it's a really good reminder, keep your dogs on leash, keep your cats indoors. Birds are so much happier when those things can happen. A fourth species of our red alert species, and a rather unfortunately named one, is the mountain plover. Mountain plovers are not really very mountainous. They like grasslands. They do nest and hang out in mountain meadows, so they'll find high elevation grasslands, but it's really the flat grasslands that they're after. But mountain plovers, what their names, mountain plovers, what we'll call them. This is a winter visitor, so they usually arrive in November into the Delta, and they hang out here all winter long. However, this is actually a really understudied species, especially considering how close it is to so many people, so many universities. Like it's a fairly readily accessible bird, and yet has sort of flown under the radar of a lot of research. So very little, for example, is known about their migration patterns and movements and behaviors. Because of their habitat preferences and these big open grasslands, that puts them into conflict with many human uses. We like grasslands a lot. We live on grasslands. We use grasslands. So everything from conversion of those grasslands into things like orchards or vineyards means that that's a lot of destroyed habitat they face. And even when it's not specifically destroyed habitat by converting it into other uses, even just being around agriculture means that these species are often exposed to pesticides. And so that can really impact their sort of vitality and reproductive success and stuff like that. And the final red alert species is migratory here in the Delta, and that is the Allen's hummingbird. This bird has a really fun geographic expanse where they winter in a pretty isolated, pretty discrete section of central Mexico, up in the mountains of central Mexico. And they migrate to, again, a pretty discrete, isolated sliver of the coast of California and Oregon. The Delta lies right on that migratory path. And so we see Allen's hummingbirds stopping by here in the Delta as they zip back and forth from that breeding ground to their wintering grounds and back. This is another bird that has suffered pretty significant population declines in the past few decades. And those are kind of due to threats of habitat loss. You know, a lot of humans like to live in coastal California and coastal Oregon. They're beautiful areas. And that's kind of rough for Allen's hummingbirds because unfortunately, unlike many hummingbirds that are very tolerant of humans, think like ruby-throated hummingbirds back east or our resident Anna's hummingbirds here in California, which have a hugely high tolerance for humans. They'll nest right next to people's houses, busy streets. They don't care at all. Allen's hummingbirds kind of disagree with that. They don't really like to nest close to human developments. And so that means that as more and more humans develop an area, that's just pushing Allen's hummingbirds out of more and more of their habitat. This species does really highlight the importance of planting nectar sources because if if you're on this bird's migratory path anywhere, and if you're even if you live in their breeding area or their wintering areas, and you can have sort of a quieter part of the yard, some part of your property that's maybe a little bit farther from human disturbance, and can plant some hummingbird pollinated flowers there, some great nectar sources, you can be providing a really useful bastion of food for this species and helping them get to where they're going because they need every bit of help they can possibly get. Now, beyond specifically birds, the Delta is facing some significant threats. And honestly, there's a long list of threats to the Delta. But I really wanted to focus on three of them today: invasive species, subsidence, and saltwater intrusion. This picture is of a levee break in the Delta, and that's gonna play a part in some of these talks. So you can see that pretty dramatic destruction of this whole levee just ripped through by the water. But first, before we get to levees, let's talk invasive species. The Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta is one of the most invaded landscapes in the country. Think like the Florida Everglades level of invasion, where like it seems like every crazy species that shows up there can live there and find a home, and often wreaks havoc with the native species that live there. The Delta is a lot like that. We have a wide variety of invasive animals, from European starlings and nutria, like the two pictured here, to like invertebrates. There are several different kinds of mussel. The golden mussel is sort of the newest kid on the block. It's a new invasive species that's just recently been found in the Delta, and it's probably going to be spreading quite a bit unless people can get a handle on it and remove that invasive species before it really takes off. But it's a tricky thing to do. And there are more coming. More invasive species are definitely on the way. And we also have invasive plants like water hyacinth, which is sort of the foreground plant in the lower picture here. Water primrose, which is that sort of more yellowy green plant in the background of this picture in the bottom. And also arundo, which is this giant cane. They're huge stalks. They kind of look a little bit like bamboo. And all of these and many more invasive plants are tremendously destructive. And all of the species, animals and plants alike, come in, they push out native species, they alter how nutrients and water flows through a habitat, so they can really alter an entire environment and make it much less hospitable or useful in terms of habitat for all the native species that evolved in the Delta. And they can also do something called, they form monocultures, where they pretty much push out everything except themselves. So you have this dramatic drop in biodiversity. An area that could have hundreds of different species of plants will have just one or two. Subsidence is a problem in the Delta that the way I see it, it's a very Delta problem. And it's a kind of weird process. So if you look in these vertical stacked images here, that top one is kind of the way the Delta historically looked like 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, where you've got significant bodies of water that's shown in these sort of the blue sections on either side. And then in between, you've got kind of an island. But honestly, this island, most of the soil and most of the plants are basically at waterline. So it's an island, but it's a very marshy, very wet island. Unfortunately, once Europeans came and found the Delta, we talked about how useful Delta soils are for agriculture. Europeans started to use that soil and try to figure out ways of removing the water from these areas, from these islands. They had to remove the water because most of the crops that we grow will drown basically if you try to plant them in this like completely saturated, marshy, boggy kind of soil. There are not very many of our crops that do well in that kind of soil. So they'd install pumps, they would do all sorts of things to drain the water out of these islands. And that would do two things. One is that would cause the actual soil itself to kind of collapse, right? All these little spaces that were filled with water, if you take the water out, those spaces just sort of fall in on themselves. And that's one of the causes of something called subsidence, where the land actually just drops. The other crazy thing that happens with these peat soils that results in subsidence as well, that contributes to subsidence, has to do with all the carbon that is stored in the soil. You remember earlier I said that peat soils are really high in carbon. That was going to be important. Well, this is where that comes to play. Because once peat soils dry out, once you start removing all that water and it dries out, and oxygen gets in there, there are a huge diversity of different microbes that colonize the soil and start consuming the organic matter in that soil and releasing it just like we do when we breathe out as carbon dioxide. And so crazy as this sounds, there's actually a lot of the soil that was peat soil in the Delta that we have lost because microbes have turned it into a gas and it has floated away. This has resulted in drops of 10, 15, 20, 30, almost 40 feet of loss of soil height from historic levels to where they are now. There are some islands in the Delta that are like 35, 40 feet below the level of the surrounding water on the outsides of those islands. And this sets up a few really big problems. One is to keep all that water out means that we have to build big levees to hold all that water weight out from these islands. And of course, as subsidence continues and that soil level drops farther and farther and farther, the pressure from all that water on the outsides of these islands just gets heavier and stronger and heavier and stronger. Throw in a little bit of climate change and some sea level rise, and that just exacerbates the problem even more. This difference between the height of the soil level inside the island and the height of the water outside those levees just gets more and more dramatic, which means that more and more work has to be done to maintain these levees. Maintaining levees is expensive, it's hard, sometimes it can be dangerous. And it also sets things up so that when a levee fails, it's a really big problem. It's very hard to come back from. If a levee fails, if there's a big flood or an earthquake maybe that destabilizes a levee, water will just rush in from the outside and fill that interior island, right? Because the ground level is so low. And so it'll fill with water. And now you don't have an island anymore. You've just got a flooded bathtub where you can basically just see the ring of the bathtub and all the interior is completely flooded. This can often lead to sort of a chain reaction where water is so heavy and there's so much force involved when a levee breaks that when the levee breaks on one side and all that water rushes in and fills up the interior of the island, it'll then blow out the levee on the other side of the island, making even more damage, sometimes leading to forces on the next levee of the next island over being impacted. And you get on this sort of dropping of dominoes effect where many islands can get destroyed. So there's a lot invested in making sure that doesn't happen. But it's kind of an almost impossible thing to try to really be successful at long term. I mean, we live in California. We're a very seismically active area. There are going to be earthquakes. And so, when one of those big earthquakes comes, and if it destabilizes enough levees, that's going to be a really big problem. So the question is, what do we do about that? Well, subsidence reversal is a big effort in the Delta. There are many groups working on it, and that's good. It's a slow process. A bunch of different techniques exist to try to reverse and sort of build that soil back up, accrete more peat soils in, and build that up so that you're sort of reversing the historic loss of soil and getting it back to that pre-European levels. The best way to do it is to just plant a bunch of wetland vegetation, flood it a little bit, have enough water in there so the wetland plants have the habitat they like, and then let them sort of recreate the historic process of plants living, dying, contributing their materials to the soil, and building up more and more and more layers of peat soil. The problem is it's a slow process. It works, but it's not fast. And so people are just trying to get as many wetlands managed into as many of these islands as possible that aren't being used for agriculture and trying to reverse as much of the subsidence as possible. There are, however, many islands that are still being farmed. And so that soil is just dropping more and more and more, sometimes by as much as an inch a year. And who knows when that's going to stop? It's continuing. It's a continuing problem. So there's definitely a lot of work on subsidence. It's a very big problem. And while there are some techniques to start to reverse it, a lot more work has to be done. And the final thing I want to talk about is saltwater intrusion. If you look at this map, the blue colors represent fresher water, and you can see all the rivers sort of flowing down with all their fresh water carrying it down and collecting, kind of merging together and pushing out that redder water, which is salt water, and kind of holding it out at the Carquinez Strait. And so it's really important to have all of that water flowing down all those rivers and putting this kind of fire hose pressure on that salt water to kind of hold the salt water at bay. You can imagine if the flows in those rivers were reduced, maybe because climate change means we're going to get less rain, or maybe because more human uses draw off more of those waters to other parts of the state. The force of that fire hose, that freshwater fire hose, pushing out to the Carquinez Strait, holding the salt water back in the bay, that force of water weakens. And so salt water would move east deeper into the delta. This is a problem for a whole bunch of things. It's a problem for drinking water because a lot of Californians drink water that comes through or from the delta. And drinking salt water, that's not so great. It's a big problem for agriculture because most of the plants that we grow for food, they don't grow so well in really salty soils. It's also a huge problem for all the native species in the delta. There are a huge number of species of fish, birds, other creatures that have evolved for particular levels of salinity. Maybe they like it really salty and they live in the bay. Maybe they like it pretty fresh, where they're in sort of the western delta, sorry, the eastern delta. Maybe they like particular bands of sort of the in-between brackish salinity, and they've evolved particular slivers of that salinity gradient where they like to live. If the flows of water down those rivers change and those gradients of salinity move, that's going to make it really hard for a lot of those species. They're going to have to relocate to find the new place where their particular salinity concentration exists, if it even exists at all. This is one of the things that really gets me going when I hear politicians say things like, oh, water flowing down rivers is just wasted. It's just flowing out to the ocean and wasted. I drove through Central California, down the valley, and it was amazing how many signs there were along the freeway that said, like, hey, Gavin Newsom, stop wasting all of our water, just letting it flow out to the ocean. Or, oh, river water flowing to the ocean is wasted water. It's really not. Those rivers are not only are they important from an intrinsic standpoint of just being a river and naturally being part of the landscape and how important that is. Not only is having a river function as a river important for the huge number of native species that rely on rivers, it's also really important for us humans because keeping that salt water out towards the bay has a ton of very direct human benefits that will go away if we reduce the amount of water flowing down those rivers and put that water someplace else. So saltwater intrusion, definitely a big problem. But luckily, there is more and more recognition coming to the Delta and sort of noticing how important a place it is and working to sort of restore it. This kind of darkened area on this map shows the sort of historic watershed of all those different rivers and all that different land that ends up ultimately bringing water down into the Central Valley, into the Delta, and ultimately flowing out the Carquinez Strait. There have been several attempts at sort of defining the Delta, everything from this sort of historic watershed level down to the legal Delta that was attempted in 2009 to the current sort of recognition that kind of everyone's sort of settling on, which is the designation of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta National Heritage Area, which happened in 2019. This is a border of that heritage area, and this was created by an act of Congress, and it is the first national heritage area in California, and which I think is pretty exciting. And it was established to, and this is a quote straight from the act that created the area. It was there to highlight the area's, quote, rich tapestry of indigenous peoples and immigrants from around the world, natural beauty and wildlife and engineering marvels, bustling metropolitan areas, and picturesque rural towns. It's a really interesting place that has now national recognition of being a really important, really cool place to hang out. Beyond that, habitat restoration is another thing that people are doing a lot of in the Delta to kind of bring it back a little bit towards its historic kind of native natural environment. This are a couple of pictures from a habitat restoration project that I managed when I was working at the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy. So you can see in the before picture here, this is an urban creek that was highly engineered, basically to just take floodwater, stormwaters, off of the urban areas of Brentwood and Oakley and move it out to the Delta kind of as quickly as possible. That engineering meant that it was a pretty narrow channel. The channel had pretty steep sides, which were often armored with things like concrete or stone, so not very much habitat. It meant that there was not a lot of space for the stream to kind of be sinuous and move and form a more natural stream like shape. It also meant that there was really no floodplain or sort of broader habitat area for the stream to float onto and for native species to live on. Just this very tightly constrained, very urban, very engineered shape. The grant that I managed came in and kind of tried to change almost all of those things. We moved the trails that were on the edges of those levees, on the edges of the creek, back quite a ways, which meant that we were then able to excavate parts of those banks to make this much broader, flatter area to give this creek some floodplain so that when the waters rise and fall seasonally, they have some places to go. They can introduce more nutrients and kind of recharge those floodplain areas. They can kind of start to carve more sinuous paths, be a little bit more creek shaped. The grant also went in and planted hundreds of trees and thousands of other plants, from grasses to shrubs to wildflowers, all sorts of things along these floodplains and along these new banks, these much more sort of setback, relaxed banks. And this after picture now shows 8 years later. So these two pictures were basically taken 8 years apart. And it shows like these amazing cottonwoods that are growing. Some of those cottonwoods are like 25, 30 feet tall. It's a much more natural feeling environment now. It's shaded, it's cooler. There's a lot more shade on the water, which keeps the water temperature down lower. There are tons of insects and birds that now use this corridor. It's a really exciting thing to be able to be a part of and to see happen. And really, in the grand scheme of things, 8 years, not that long. So, can these projects be complicated? Sure. Can they be expensive? Definitely. Can they be difficult? Sometimes, yeah. But do they work? Yes, they do. They work, and that's really exciting. And that is just one of dozens of projects that just the Delta Conservancy is doing within the Delta. And the Delta Conservancy is just one of many organizations doing this kind of work. Here's a map of a bunch of other projects that either are completed or they're in the works that the Delta Conservancy is working on. And there are certainly, hopefully, more on the way. And this is a time to recognize how important it is for us as a people, as a society, to put our money where our mouth is and to see that money doing good. So I'm not sure how many of you remember or how excited any of you got, but last November on the ballot, there was Proposition 4, which was this big climate bond. And it passed. We, the voters of California, said, yes, we want to spend this money. And that was fantastic because that is exactly the kind of money that goes to organizations like the Delta Conservancy and also the agency that I work at now, the Wildlife Conservation Board, and that is used to get these projects funded. So passing legislation like Proposition 1 a few years ago and like Proposition 4 last year have very direct effects on getting habitat restoration done and bringing areas that are highly degraded into a much more natural, much more sort of ecologically healthy situation. So to anyone who voted for Proposition 4 last November, my thanks. And like I said, it works, and I want to kind of leave us with two fun success stories. One is the Nuttall's woodpecker. This image is another one of Martha's creations from the book. And this Nuttall's woodpecker is another sort of near endemic. The vast majority of the range of the Nuttall's woodpecker is within California, but it's not 100%. This bird is a resident in the Delta and resident throughout most of California, and it lives in oaks. It loves oak woodlands, although it does not eat acorns. And in part because of its love of oaks, and in part because of the shared love of oaks that we humans have, this population has actually been slightly increasing for several decades now, which is really exciting. It's an example of when we give birds the habitat they need, the birds will use them, the birds will be there, the birds will benefit from it. Another really cool example of this is the yellow-billed cuckoo. This is kind of a weird one because this species is actually quite widespread across North America. And back east, it's common and its population is doing well. It's like a totally different beast. Because out west here, it's really not. It's quite rare. It's a specialist just breeding in riparian habitats. And because of the loss of so many of those riparian habitats, currently its breeding population is just reduced to just these few little patches around California. That reduction in habitat and a consequent reduction in population level has put the western subspecies of the yellow-billed cuckoo up for candidate listing to, to federal endangered status. However, again, because of the federal environment right now, I'm not really sure that that's going to go forward. I'm not holding my breath. And so it means that we as California are going to have to sort of step up and do the work ourselves. The federal government is probably not going to come to our aid in this one. But one really encouraging thing about the species is that, they love riparian forests. They specialize in it. But when we humans can come in and plant the type of riparian forest that they specialize on, we can give them what they need, these birds can respond quite fast. In fact, they can sometimes be found breeding, sort of recolonizing restored habitats in as little as 3 years after those habitats are installed, which is really fast for a bird. 3 years after those habitats go in, 3 years after those habitat restoration projects are completed, is really encouraging, really rewarding, really fast speed for how sort of willing yellow-billed cuckoos are to follow the sort of if you build it, they will come philosophy. So it's one of these things where these projects can be complicated, they can be expensive, they can be difficult, but they really do work. And so I'd like to leave you with this quote that I actually opened my book with, and that is from Anna Botsford Comstock. To hear some of our bird devotees talk, one would think that to be able to identify a bird is all of bird study. But on the contrary, the identification of the birds is simply the alphabet to the real study, the alphabet by means of which we may spell out the life habits of the bird. To know these habits is the ambition of the true ornithologist. And I hope that you can all embrace the idea of really studying, really getting into birds beyond just identification. I hope that this talk maybe sheds some light on the deeper intricacies of the birds and also the habitats of the Delta and how they intersect. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. And if there's any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. And this is all of my sort of contact information. My A Birding Naturalist YouTube channel is where this QR code takes you. So please feel free to stay in touch. And thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Aaron. If anyone has any questions, just drop them into the chat and we will share them. Um, we also dropped the link to your WordPress site earlier, so um,
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
find that in your in.
Yeah. And if you go to that article at the bottom of every piece that I write, there's also links to all of my other places. So you can find my YouTube channel and everything else.
Again. Karen asked, how can we find out about joining you on a bird walk?
Oh, yeah. So I don't lead. I don't have a system where I like lead, second Saturday kind of like regular bird walks. But if you're ever in the Delta and if you want to set something up, reach out. Use any of these platforms, and I'm happy to go birding with people like practically anytime that I can get away.
There's a couple of sort of interesting questions here. Let's start with this first. The second one first. How much effect did hydraulic mining have on the Delta?
So yeah, historically, it had a huge effect. I mean, especially in kind of the more eastern parts of the Delta, there is a lot of debris, like those river cobbles that were pushed out of the foothills and out of the mountains by hydraulic mining, and that have now made their way down rivers like the American River and the Feather River and the McCollum. and are now making their way into the delta. The other huge impact that hydraulic mining had on the delta is mercury contamination. One of the things that was highly used during hydraulic mining to help identify gold and bind gold was a lot of mercury. And that has now made its way well into the delta. It's in all the delta sediments. It's in most of the delta fish. It's working its way through sort of the delta ecosystems. So that's been a big impact, um, and an ongoing impact in the delta.
The next question. Um, there are a couple of questions about your favorite spots, but
Ah,
to bird in the Delta.
yeah. So there's some great places to bird in the delta for sure. Two that I think are really easily worth highlighting are the YOLO bypass. So if any of you have driven from like the Bay Area to Sacramento, you've probably gone over the bypass, over the causeway on Highway 80. And that area between sort of Davis and Sacramento is a huge long corridor of habitat that is really amazing birding to go and visit. There's auto tour routes, there's walking trails, there's a lot of stuff to see. It's especially great in the wintertime when all of the ducks and geese and shorebirds flood in there. But any time of year, it's awesome. The other place is the Casumnas River Preserve. That's like the crown jewel of the Delta in a lot of ways, in terms of sort of natural environment and bird diversity. An amazing place to visit, never disappoints.
Um, who was it? Somebody here. Oh, Jane asked if you had any comment on sandhill cranes.
I do have common sandal cranes. Yeah, very cool species. This is a species that comes here during the winter time. So it's a migrant species, and this is one of their sort of final destinations for their winter. And there are several big parts of the delta that are managed specifically for crane habitat, and it's really cool to be able to go out and see them. You can, if you're sort of in the right spot in the right time of year and you get lucky, can see really dramatic fly-ins of cranes, and they're noisy and they're big and they're impressive, very iconic, cool birds. Another thing to note about cranes is they're so iconic and so cool that there's actually the Lodi Sandhill Crane Festival every November. That's like a celebration of all things cranes. It's sort of starting to broaden out to more birds in general, but definitely the focus is still on cranes. And it's in Lodi. I think this year it's going to be the 7th, 8th, and 9th of November. And so, yeah, it's a cool place to hang out if you want to learn more about cranes and go on some crane tours and do all sorts of crane oriented things.
Yeah, cranes are awfully cool. They're a favorite of mine too. Let's see. We've got some great questions here tonight. If I miss
Excellent.
one, if you, so just please put your, oh, yes, I see you got it there. Okay. We talked about yellow. Katie asked, what allows red-winged blackbirds to fare better, than tricolored blackbirds?
Mm, great question. So I think there are kind of two things that red-winged blackbirds have that kind of is an advantage in sort of the modern era over tricolors. One is they're much more adaptable in terms of where they're willing to breed. They're perfectly happy breeding in almost any kind of sort of wettish habitat, and they'll make it work. Whereas tricolored blackbirds are much more limited in kind of the structure of the plants that they're looking for, and so they have sort of a much narrower tolerances for where they breed. The other thing is that tricolored blackbirds, I mentioned that they nest in these big colonies. They seem to need that big colony kind of dynamic where to trigger breeding, it's almost like a tricolored blackbird has to be around other tricolored blackbirds who are also breeding, and they kind of feed off each other. But that means that if you don't have a lot of tricolored blackbirds in an area, it's kind of hard to get those wheels started. And red-winged blackbirds don't have this. If you have a male and a female red-winged blackbird by themselves, they're perfectly happy to form a nest and raise babies. So they don't have that sort of communal aspect where they need a big group together to be reproductively successful.
Hmm, interesting. Um, Now, this may not be a question that you can answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
I'll take a
There's
swing.
reduction in corvids in Berkeley. Any evidence that is due to West Nile? Um,
Um, I'm not I'm not sure about Berkeley specifically, but I would guess yes. There's definitely evidence. Um, you know, we're not in a huge West Nile virus outbreak right at the moment, but they come by sort of cyclically. And when those cycles do come by, they hit corvids harder across the state. So I mean, it definitely happens here in the Central Valley. I would certainly guess it happens in Berkeley just as much. So I would bet a decent amount of money that yes, part of the reduction in corvids numbers that you're seeing is the
yeah.
result of West Nile.
It may also
Avian
be.
flu, though, avian flu is another one that seems to hit corvids more than other ones. So it's like a 1-2 punch kind of thing going on right now.
Yeah. I mean, they also this time of year the large flocks will have dispersed because they're in they're in breeding right now, although that's
Yeah,
almost done. They're but so shortly they'll start to gather again in large flocks. But they
yeah,
the
especially like the crows getting those huge winter flocks.
yeah. Let's see. There's some questions here I know I missed. Talked about YOLO bypass. Delta tunnels. Comment on the Delta tunnels.
Yeah, the Delta tunnels are kind of a complicated mess, honestly. So in case anyone doesn't know, the Delta tunnels, this project that's been proposed um, to route to basically excavate one or maybe just two or one. The plans are fluxing, but big tunnels under the delta to allow fresh water to be pulled from kind of the northern edge of the delta in the Sacramento River, where the water is very fresh and far, far away from the salt. Bring it under in these pipes under the delta and straight to the beginning of the California aqueduct, which is at the southern end of the delta. So huge, long tunnels, big in diameter, underneath many different islands. It would be a huge engineering project. And there are a bunch of things to be concerned about. Um, I mean, what do you do with all the dirt that you're pulling out from under the ground and all the mercury that's in that soil and like everything? Like, where do you put that? That's a big thing. How much disturbance would be caused to the land above where these tunnels are going to go in as it's being dug out underneath? That's another thing. And then, of course, the big concern is once these things get built, what's to stop like major sort of power groups like the big agribusiness groups in Southern California and Metropolitan Water of Los Angeles and stuff like that from just starting to pull water from the Sacramento River, even when they don't necessarily have to, and therefore sort of disrupting a lot of the water flow dynamics in the Delta. So, a lot of concerns. Um, One thing, though, that I don't think gets enough attention from critics of the tunnels is the issue of what do you do? Because just the do nothing actually isn't a great solution either. Because in my talk, I talked about subsidence, right? And how these delta islands are very vulnerable to being flooded. If that were to happen, all that salt water from the bay would rush in and flood, and the saltwater intrusion would really become much more dramatic, which would absolutely impact drinking water in California. And that might very well lead to even more catastrophic actions from those industries, from those metropolitan areas to secure the fresh water that they need. So the tunnels could be bad, but doing nothing is also likely to be bad. And so, which one is the worst? Which one is the biggest danger? Is there another solution out there? It's very complicated, and it's not. The thing that I will say about it is it's not as black and white as I think a lot of people treat it as on both sides.
Thank you. That's a nice analysis. Let's see, did I miss any questions here? Opportunities for volunteering on habitat restoration projects. Of course, we have many in along the bay, but where they're not, we don't do work in the Delta, but I'm sure there are.
Yeah, there absolutely are. So there are your sort of sister chapters of the Audubon Society. There's the Yellow Bird Alliance. There is the Sacramento. uh, Sacramento Audubon Society, which is currently changing its name to the Sacramento Bird Alliance. Um, and these are groups that all do habitat restoration projects and they welcome volunteers. There are other groups like the American River Conservancy and the Sacramento Valley Conservancy that also are involved in habitat restoration that welcome volunteers at many of their projects. And there are also nonprofits that you can check out, like Point Blue Conservation Science and the Nature Conservancy and groups like that that also have many habitat restoration projects. And I definitely know that at least some of them are very open to having volunteers show up. So lots of opportunities to help out. And we love it. Like volunteering is great. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I think that answers everybody's questions. Wait. Well, I think you sort of answered this, actually. Oh, wait, what is there? Um, comment on the new state park in, what's it called now?
Dos Rios.
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really cool state park. Actually, the agency I work for paid for a very large chunk of that land to be purchased for that state park, for the creation of that state park. I actually went on a site visit, 6 months ago or so, before it was officially open to the public. I got to look around. It's really exciting because that's an area that has not had a lot of state park access for the public. And now it's going to have this really beautiful, really cool area to go to. It's also a really neat area because of the tribal involvement. There are several different groups, um, tribal groups, that have been really involved in replanting native species and sort of bringing back cultural practices on the land. And so it's been a really neat partnership to see develop. And I think it'll be a really cool place to be able to go and see as the plants and everything, all that ecosystem sort of mechanisms that have gotten started mature and grow up.
Well, thank you, Aaron, so much, and thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. Next month, we'll be learning about long-billed curlews, which is another exciting Delta species. And I look forward to seeing you all then. And in August, we'll be meeting in person for our annual meeting and lecture. The details of that will be coming along very soon. So thank you all for joining us, and I'll look forward to seeing you all next month. Good night,
Thank
everybody.
you all so much.